Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine. Yes, indeed, it's the favorite topic of every man with a microphone and internet connection, and I do admit, dear viewer, that I am no different. The war, or 3-day special operation for the Russians, has been grinding on for a year and a half or so now, with very little change until recently, since those first few chaotic weeks where the Russians nearly reached the capital in Kiev before turning around and leaving. Far from its beginnings as a fast-moving, quickly evolving, multi-front clash, the war in Ukraine is now much closer to the Eastern Front in World War I than its sequel, as we expected. For the most part, this has been due to the difficulties of making large advances against fortified positions in modern war, although this is something that hasn't changed much since some caveman figured it would be a good idea to stand behind something while having rocks thrown at him. The issue with this is that society is, obviously, very different from how it was in the early 20th century, meaning that while we thankfully aren't seeing too many mass infantry charges against machine guns and artillery like we did then, though there actually have been some, we simply aren't seeing much of anything between the two sides besides minor skirmishing and limited advances of groups of armored vehicles. Summed up, the war in Ukraine has become a race to the bottom, and despite recent advances and hope on the Ukrainian side of finally making a breakthrough, the story for the most part has been one of stalemate, seeing who runs out of patience and calls it quits first. Initially, this seemed to favor Ukraine and its Western allies, but as things have continued and as they currently stand today, it is Vladimir Putin who it seems could come out on top of this race to the bottom. If you've been living under a rock for the last 2 years, or maybe just need a refresher, Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, and initially it was suspected by Western advisors and military leaders that Ukraine would last less than 3 days against the Russian army. However, 3 days, the time initially allotted by Putin for the special military operation — it's illegal in Russia to call it a war — came and went, and Kiev had still not fallen. 3 more days pass, then a few more, and now it looks like the Ukrainians are going to hold out against the initial assault after all. Western aid in the form of training, equipment, and loans came flooding in, especially from the United States. And with this aid and no small number of Ukrainian lives, the Russians were pushed back from Kiev. This was tempered by losses in the east and south, where the Russians advanced from Crimea, which, if you'll remember, was seized by Russia all the way back in 2014. From there, the front line stabilized, running along most of the eastern portion of Ukraine and covering quite a lot of ground, over 1,000 kilometers. This past spring was the start of Ukraine's much-hyped counteroffensive, so hyped that it surprised no one on the Russian side and has managed, again with a few recent exceptions, very little headway in the months since it began. This has led some of Ukraine's Western allies, with America leading the way, starting to get cold feet about the continuous aid needed to sustain an army in a large front traditional war. The White House has seemingly realized this somewhat, and proposed aid packages are generally not as large as they were initially, but votes to pass them are also getting narrower and narrower. The first package in May 2022 was $40 billion, and it passed 86-11, a rare sight in the currently heavily polarized times. Fast forward to this July, and the Senate had to defeat an effort to limit future aid 71-13. Still quite good, but starting to slip. Obviously, things are beginning to sour as more and more continues to be given, with the current total being around $77 billion from the United States alone. Most of it, a touch over 60% that is, obviously being military aid. This is the situation just here in the United States, and obviously the many allied nations of Europe and NATO have different levels of commitment to the Ukrainian cause, ranging from a Hungarian government that has in the past often preferred Putin to its fellow EU states, to others like the United Kingdom and Sweden who have been, for the most part at least, some of the largest supporters of Ukraine on that side of the Atlantic. Of course, there's also the Polish, who initially had a lot of enthusiasm due to their own border with Russia, but have also slowly began backing off, due in part to having finished giving away all their old and outdated equipment, which they then replaced with much newer American equipment at a discounted rate due to the ongoing war and fears early on that Russia may expand it to Poland itself. Very cheeky Poland, but well done, honestly. Now, this obviously isn't the case for all NATO members, but another reason why their initial fervor has waned, besides the simple fact that it's dragging on and piling up lots of broken bodies and equipment, and a random diplomatic fight over grain, is that the world has learned a lot about the Russian army in the past months, mainly that it's not as good as we thought. This lack of progress against what was at the beginning of the war considered a second-rate army, the need to conscript more and more of its civilians, doing this and then not having any equipment to give them or ability to train them, then because that's happening you have to rely heavily on mercenaries, who you then also don't supply before allegedly trying to end them before they can end you, which makes them come try to end you, and forces regular troops to be diverted and communications and logistics to be thrown into chaos as you're nearly overthrown. Well, looking at it all written out, it's not hard to see why many observers initially felt like a longer war favored Ukraine. However, since the beginning of the counteroffensive, we've seen that, while they can't advance, the incredibly corrupt Russian army is capable of holding an entrenched and fortified position at the very least. And since the Wagner incident a few months ago, all seems to be quiet from the Russian army as far as new major issues of that caliber go. Just a boring slog, wasting both nations' money and equipment while accomplishing little. A phase like this, however, is where I believe Putin has the advantage, as Ukraine currently needs continuous aid still to hold its position, while the Russians are seemingly content to sit there with however much they happen to have. Ukraine's reliance on foreign aid, not that it has much choice, may end up being its downfall, since the countries they rely on are generally more free and open democracies than Russia. So if voters somewhere like Britain or Germany get tired of supporting the war, their politicians will either need to listen or face their party losing voters and therefore political power in the next election. Putin, on the other hand, is able to simply clamp down on his people, as he's done time and again whenever opposition to the war bubbled to the surface in the Russian homeland. There's certainly a limit to this, of course, some amount of death and destruction that would cause the Russian people to take to the streets en masse, and that's why I think Putin is content to keep things as they are now. Lower intensity conflict means lower intensity unrest at this point. Russia can afford and may even want for everyone in the nation to be apathetic more than anything else towards this war. Ukraine, on the other hand, requires its allies' people to be actively in support of the war, since an apathetic populace in these countries would most likely lead to huge reductions, if not outright cancellations of aid, leaving them vulnerable to Russian attack. This sums up why the current size and scope of the war may actually favor Russia. A continuation of how things are will eventually drive Western voters towards at best apathy, and at worst, for Ukraine that is, towards being outright against aid being sent by their governments. If and or when this happens, Putin just needs to keep a lid on his own country long enough to overrun what will then be an outgunned Ukraine that's been left to sink or swim on its own, and victory will be his, even if it did take a few hundred days longer than it was supposed to. This is how Ukraine has become a race to the bottom, with the question being not necessarily whose army will give out first, but whose civilian support structure that backs it will. For a while, defense favored Ukraine, as it proved they could hold out in the first place. But as the war drags on, Ukraine needs victories to convince its allies that they're backing a winning cause and to continue their support. The Russians, meanwhile, just need to avoid giving them one long enough for the EU and NATO to throw in the towel and write off the whole venture as an expensive money pit that needs to stop being fed, as without this support the Ukrainian army would, at the very least, not be able to maintain the current size and scope of the war in a way that the Russians will, which could very well spell defeat. So the question moving forward is whether or not Ukraine can achieve these victories and convince the West to keep the aid flowing. And while the recent advances of Ukrainian armored vehicles through the three-tiered Russian defensive perimeter have been promising, much more work remains before the breakthrough can be properly exploited, giving Putin time to re-solidify and continue the grind that may very well be his best hope of victory. But who knows what the future may bring? Certainly not someone like me who's barely coherent, and I will keep doing that every chance I get. But anyway, let me know in the comments down below your own thoughts on this. Am I right? Totally wrong? Maybe somewhere in between? I can't know until you tell me. Anyway, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course, have a nice day.